Good evening, everybody. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to our special event tonight. Adath Israel's special Zoom presentation featuring Jeff Rubin, who'll be discussing his recent book, The Expendables, How the Middle Class Got Screwed by Globalization. I am Stephen Belchett, Senior Vice President at TE Wealth, where we're responsible for providing financial peace of mind to individuals and families across Canada. And I've been in the investment business for over 30 years. We do recognize that our community right now is experiencing very difficult times, and I hope that you're all staying well and safe. Thanks to technology, we're still able to provide valuable, interesting events for all of you, despite not being able to meet in person, which is always a lot more intimate. I would like to extend a thank you to the Adult Education Committee under the chairmanship of Joe Traeger and Phil David, Executive Chairman of Adath, and his staff for putting on tonight's program. Our featured guest tonight is Jeff Rubin, a distinguished economist and best-selling author. His presentation, no doubt, will be insightful and informative. I have followed Jeff for many years since my early days in the business, and have always enjoyed reading his material and listening to his speeches over the years. You can order his book by clicking on the book order icon on the program's invite. We're also very pleased to have, as tonight's moderator, Norman Levine, who's a highly respected member of our investment community. Norman is Managing Director of Portfolio Management Corporation, is a BA from York University, an MBA from Syracuse University, and is a chartered financial analyst. He has 42 years of investment management experience. Community activities that Norm is involved in include being a member of the board of the Adath, Maple Downs Golf Club, Chairman of the Investment Advisory Committee of the United Jewish Welfare Fund, a member of investment committees of Holland Bloorview Kids Hospital, the Toronto Scouts Foundation, and the Advisory Committee of the Jewish Federation. Norman was recently featured in the book Market Masters by Rubin Special. And finally, Norman fondly remembers when Jeff Rubin was chief economist at Wood Gundy and how those presentations were different than he'd ever experienced from any other economist. Without further ado, welcome, Norman.
There we go. Hi, everybody. Jeff Rubin is the former chief economist at CIBC World Markets and a former senior fellow at the Center for International Government's Innovation and an award-winning author of the #1 bestseller, Why Your World is About to Get a Whole Lot Smaller. His recently published bestseller, and here it is, The Expendables, How the Middle Class Got Screwed by Globalization, is a national bestseller, and I must tell you that it's an extremely easy book to read, written in plain English that everybody will understand and will enjoy. On a personal note, what Stephen was kind of alluding to, I remember when Jeff was chief economist at Wood Gundy, which is the precursor to CIBC World Markets, and it was in the early 90s. Economists are in the business of predicting. You also hope you're right more than you're wrong when you're predicting, and every once in a while you hope to hit a home run. One day he came into my office, as usual, cracking the gum he was chewing, and predicted that residential real estate prices were going to plunge. Whoever heard of such nonsense? A very prominent real estate broker took particular umbrage with that prediction, and a war of words resulted. In the end, Jeff was right, and he hit the home run of a lifetime. I'd like to present to you Jeff Rubin.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to talk to you tonight about my new book, The Expendables. I thought we'd start with, of course, the biggest event, the event of last week, the event of the US elections. Well, Joe Biden won the election, and I guess there's really little question about that. Maybe the bigger story here is that the sudden rise of American populism that Donald Trump rode triumphantly into the White House in 2016 isn't about to go away. It's basically here to stay. The blue wave, predicted by the New York Times, the CNN, indeed the vast consensus of the establishment media, failed to materialize. I mean, in fact, Donald Trump got 7 million more votes than he got in 2016. And, it looks like after getting 70 million votes and expanding his base well beyond the traditional white male base that he had in 2016, it looks like the populist roots have established firm ground. Most of the 70 million people, Americans, who voted for Donald Trump in the November elections were working class Americans, people that you might consider in the past to have belonged to the middle class. And I guess it's one of the ultimate ironies of American politics that under the tutelage of this gold-plated billionaire, the Republican Party has morphed into the party of the American working class, because that's not certainly a position that the Republican Party has had through most of its history, certainly not through any of its history in the post-war period. But the fact of the matter is that Donald Trump has essentially championed the interest of American workers like no president, at least in the post-war period, has done. I mean, you can't forget in the final days of President Obama's second presidency, he told those workers that American factory jobs were gone for good. But the fact of the matter is that from when Donald Trump came to office until the pandemic hit, over 500,000 new manufacturing jobs were created in the United States. And that wasn't an accident. That was directly a result of the actions that Donald Trump has taken. When you get right down to it, American workers have been the beneficiaries of Trump policies over the last 3 to 4 years. As I pointed out, the creation of 500,000 manufacturing jobs in the United States has reversed over a decade-long decline in factory jobs. In fact, the American economy has shed about 5 million factory jobs over the last 20 years. The Canadian economy has shed proportionally a similar amount, about 600,000 jobs. And that's directly a result of the trade policies that Donald Trump has put into place. And something else that's happened that we haven't seen in a long time, because all of a sudden, when those tariffs that President Trump imposed on places like China meant that you couldn't just move your factory to China or Mexico as you could before under the Obama administration or the Bush administration, or for that matter, the Clinton administration, lo and behold, American workers saw something that they hadn't seen for decades, and that is a real wage increase. Average hourly earnings in the United States have grown at the fastest rate in over a decade, and for the first time in several decades, have grown faster than inflation, giving workers, really for the first time, a real wage increase. So, it's funny that these things have happened because, of course, when Trump imposed those tariffs, billions of dollars of tariffs on goods made in Chinese sweatshops, American corporations, particularly corporations like Apple, which has all its iPhones and computers made in China for workers working at, say, 1/10 of what the minimum wage in California, where Apple is based, would be. All of the economists in the business press, places like the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, said that the only thing tariffs would do was raise prices to consumers. But actually, it didn't raise prices to consumers. What it did was create thousands of manufacturing jobs, hundreds of thousands of manufacturing jobs. And for the first time in a couple of decades, we're seeing a real wage increase for factory workers in the United States. Trump's immigration policies also were popular among that constituency. And I think it's particularly of note that not just among white Americans, many Latino Americans didn't want to see an open border on the Rio Grande any more than their white neighbors wanted to do. So who have been the biggest proponents of open borders? Well, the biggest proponents of open borders have been big business. And that's always been true in the United States, and that's true of other places like Canada as well. Go back 120 years ago in the era of the robber barons, Andrew Carnegie referred to migrants as a stream of gold because they were an available source of cheap labor. And that continues to be the call of big business today in the United States and elsewhere. But, domestic workers haven't always greeted waves of migration with open arms, and for good reason, because it's lowered domestic wages. And in fact, those most affected by the waves of migrants that have come over in the last 30 years in the United States, those who have been most affected are basically Black laborers. They're the last hired in the United States, and it's their wages that have been most adversely affected. And in fact, many Black men have dropped out of the labor force. The Black participation rate is significantly lower than it was about 20 years ago. So while Joe Biden will soon occupy the White House, what will his policies do for the nearly 50% of the American electorate that voted for Donald Trump and his tough trade and immigration policies? Well, certainly the Biden administration has been supported by the country's elite, and they feel that under voting for Joe Biden is a return to the status quo, the kinds of trade policies that we saw under President Obama, President Bush, and President Clinton, which were open border trade policies and were effectively a race to the bottom as far as wage earners were concerned in the United States. Well, no doubt they're rejoicing at the Biden victory, but if I were them, I wouldn't be too complacent because the populist forces that came out to vote for President Trump and his policies aren't about to go away. And I think their voice is going to be continued to be heard loudly in US politics and indeed in other places. So just who are these people? Well, these people are basically the middle class. Who is in the middle class? Well, according to the OECD, they have different income definitions of the middle class. In Canada, it's essentially people who are making between 29,000 and 70,000, a median income of around 40,000. The numbers are slightly different for the UK or the US, but basically in those zones. Those people used to be the majority of the population in countries like Canada, the United Kingdom, the United States. That's no longer the case. For the first time in the post-war period, the middle class is now a minority, not a majority of the households in our economy. Not only has the middle class shrunk in proportion of the population, but their economic impact has shrunk even more. For example, back in the 1980s, about 60% of household spending was done by middle class households. Today, that number has shrunk to about 40%. And to put that number in perspective, in the United States, that's the same percentage of household spending that the top 5% of households in the United States account for. We're also finding that the middle class is a lot poorer. Their incomes are growing at about a fifth of the pace of what they grew only a decade ago, not only in the United States, but throughout the OECD. And lastly, we're finding that the middle class is becoming a lot older. And that's because for my generation, baby boomers, membership in the middle class was essentially a lifetime gig. That once in the middle class, you were going to stay there for most of your working life. That's no longer true. That was true of 70% of baby boomers like me in Canada and the United States. It's true of only 59% of millennials. It's true of less than 50% of Generation X and Z. You know, whereas most of the generations of post-war generations in North America would expect that they would do better than their parents, today's cohort face the reality that they will do significantly worse. So we're talking about a shrinking size in the population, a shrinking economic importance in terms of household spending, and we're talking about a middle class that is becoming significantly older. In short, it's showing all the signs of extinction. And that's not just a US phenomena, that's every bit as much a Canadian phenomena. 80% of Canadian households have seen no real after-tax income gains for almost 20 years. And in fact, real wages of American and Canadian workers peaked back in the mid-70s, almost 45 years ago. That's a long time to go without a real wage increase. And it explains why so many households have been left behind. So why did that all occur? What has driven the reduction of the middle class? Well, the answer to that is really about what kind of jobs we produce in the economy and what kind of jobs we no longer produce in the economy. And in the heyday of the middle class, which certainly in Canada and the United States would have been in the 1950s and the early 1960s, most middle class workers made the very things that they consumed, whether it was cars, televisions, or toasters. Today, none of those things are made in places like Canada or the United States. They're made in places like China and Mexico, where wages cost the 10th or less of what North American workers earned. There's been lots of jobs created in North America. In fact, prior to the pandemic hitting, most economies, OECD economies, were at full employment. They were basically, you know, Canada and the United States, certainly the lowest unemployment rates we've seen in decades. But the kind of jobs that were being created today were very different than the kind of jobs that were being created in the 50s and the 1960s. Today, most of the jobs are being created in the service sector. And in fact, most of the jobs, recently, many of the jobs are being created in the gig economy. In the gig economy, workers aren't even going to be considered to be workers. they're considered to be independent contractors and hence aren't even paid the minimum wage. Today, Statistics Canada would estimate that over 10% of the labor force are gig jobs. So, we've had lots of jobs, but whereas in the past, having a job was a route out of poverty, today, many of the jobs that are created are a route into poverty. And, that reflects the changing nature of the jobs and the changing nature of our trade agreements. So one of, I guess, the puzzles or mysteries was that if we're at almost full employment as we were during the pandemic, why haven't we seen wage increases? Because in the past, when we were near full employment, wages would start to rise. It was called the Phillips curve in standard economic theory. And what it meant was that as we got to full employment, workers would have the ability to go on strike and get wage increases. And since business was brisk, employers wouldn't want to have a costly strike. Well, the reason today that we don't have strikes is because it's really hard to go on strike when you don't belong to a union. Again, in the heyday of the middle class in the 50s and 60s, 1 in every 3 commercial workers in the United States belong to a union. Today, it's 1 in 20 that belong to a union. And, and that rate of deunionization isn't just a US phenomena, it's again OECD wide. Unions, by the way, just didn't raise the wages of their own members. They raised the wages of members of workers who weren't unionized, but were in the same industries. For example, when 50% of truckers in the United States belonged to the Teamsters agreement had a big impact on what the other 50% of truckers who didn't belong to the Teamsters made. So what we've seen is a huge reduction in unionization. And there's a good reason why. Because whereas in the past, unions used to be a virtue to workers in the sense that they brought higher wages and better benefits, under free trade, where goods are free to come in from China or Mexico, duty free, made by workers who make 1/10 the wage of Canadian or American workers, unions are a huge liability. That we've seen that plant closures in unionized plants have been double non-unionized plants in North America, because typically unionized plants are higher wage paying and therefore more vulnerable to displacement by cheap labor imports from places like China and Mexico. And for that matter, the few unions that remain have very different bargaining tactics, because in most cases, going on strike has been lethal, because typically what happens when unions do go on strike is that, one midnight, a whole fleet of trucks come on a giant repo organization, cart away all the machinery they can from that factory to some new factory being opened up in Mexico. And the plant that Canadian or American workers used to work for the last 30 or 40 years has been sold to become some new high-rise condo development. So that's what this story is all about. It's interesting that it wasn't just Donald Trump who took up their mantle. So did Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders' policies on trade were not materially different than Donald Trump's. The only difference is that the Democratic Party twice prevented Sanders from getting the leadership, whereas the Republican Party wasn't as successful in thwarting Donald Trump. So let's talk a little bit about Canada, because the odd thing about Canada is that if you look at the conditions that have led to the rise of populism elsewhere, both in the United States and, for example, in the UK, where Boris Johnson got the biggest majority the Conservative Party has had since Margaret Thatcher by sweeping a whole bunch of northern industrial seats in England that had traditionally voted Labour. If you sort of look at that, you'd go, the same conditions exist in Canada. I mean, the middle class has been just as screwed by trade liberalization, by free trade deals, by NAFTA, by the World Trade Organization, as have British workers and as have American workers. Why hasn't there been a populist response in Canada? Canada, by the way, is no stranger to populism. On the left, there was the CCF that morphed into the NDP, that was basically a working class party up until Broadbent. And on the right, there was Social Credit and more recently Reform. But yet, at least up until now, all of the three major parties have been globalist outlook. We now have a new leader in the Conservative Party, Erin O'Toole, who does seem to grasp the populist message. And we'll see if ultimately we see an expression of all of those middle class expendable Canadians who have been marginalized. Will they get a political voice? And perhaps they will. As I say, they've got a voice in the UK and up until recently a voice in the United States. And I suspect in the US, they're not going to be going away. One last issue to address, and then maybe I'll wrap it up, is if you hear most economists talk, they'll tell you that free trade's the best thing around, and that's sort of been the way most economists have thought for the last 200 years, ever since David Ricardo published his theory of comparative advantage, which basically said that if every country did what it did best and specialized that in a world of free trade, we'd all be better off. Economics has never been blind to the fact that free trade would create losers. In fact, neoclassical economics identified exactly who those losers would be in a free trade environment. It would be farmers in land scarce countries. It would be capitalists in capitalist scarce economies. And it would be laborers in labor scarce economies, like in Canada and the United States. So it's no mystery that this has happened. In theory, if GDP is bigger as a result of free trade, then the gains from GDP could be redistributed so to make everybody better off, so that the losers could be compensated. But the reality has been that the very process of free trade has meant that it's been more and more difficult to compensate the losers, just as free trade created more and more losers in our economy. That measures that would distribute those gains in GDP from free trade from the winners to the losers, measures like increasing corporate tax, measures like increasing the capital gains tax or tax on dividends, measures like raising the minimum wage, measures like imposing an inheritance tax. All those measures are immediately condemned. And the argument is that if we did these things, they would hurt the very people they're intended to help, because they would induce an even greater exodus of capital and production that already exists. So not only do we have a world in which more and more of our workers are exposed to competition from foreign labor markets that pay wages a fraction of what workers get here, but at the same time, as more and more people are thrust onto the social safety net, the funding of that very social safety net is impaired, and impaired because the measures that would be funded are viewed as negative to our competitiveness. Now, I don't want to villainize corporations. I mean, I used to be the chief economist of an investment bank. I realize that as a shareholder, if I was a shareholder in Magna or GM, I'd be asking why pay $30 an hour for workers in Oshawa or Detroit when we can pay $250 an hour in Mexico. I sort of understand that. But what's sort of lacking here is a balance between the interests of shareholders and the interests of workers. Because from the interests of shareholders, global free trade is simply the imperatives of global commerce and Ricardo's dictum of international comparative advantage. But for more and most middle class households in Canada and the United States, it's been a relentless race to the bottom. Maybe at this point, I'll just stop here and open it up for questions.
There we go. I'd like to start with a couple of questions. One that you were just alluding to, a couple of them actually alluding to the auto industry. One is in your book, The Expendables, you talk about how the Canadian government mishandled the negotiations, not really understanding what they were doing as far as the potential for future auto assembly in Canada. And it was looking pretty bleak, but in the last month, it appears things have turned around maybe. What do you think and make of that and the outlook for now for the Canadian auto assembly worker?
Well, I guess my issue with what's happened is in the old days, we had a thing called the Canada-US Auto Pact. And that basically meant that American companies had to produce as many cars in Canada as they sold here. They didn't have to produce the same cars. In fact, they produced different cars. They produced, a whole model line for the North American economy. And that was the best of both worlds because we got the economies of scale that came with continental market while maintaining our share of employment. And that model worked very well. It incidentally was declared illegal by the World Trade Organization, but was replaced by NAFTA, where why wouldn't Magna or GM move its car plants to Mexico at a fraction of the wage? Now, as you point out, Norm, we have seen some success stories recently. First of all, Ford saying that it's going to keep the Oakville plant and produce electric cars, and GM saying that it's now going to create SUVs in Oshawa, and also a commitment for Chrysler for Windsor. The difference is that all of this has been levered by taxpayer support. I mean, in the case of Oakville, it was about 25% taxpayer support. Are taxpayers going to get 25% of the profits that Ford makes from that Oakville plant? I mean, taxpayers bailed out GM and Chrysler to the tune of billions in 2009 and got shortchanged for their efforts. So, I guess this works for Jerry Diaz at Unifor. He's got the plants, he's got the jobs, and that's his main concern, and I appreciate that. But I would rather see trade deals like the Auto Pact compel GM and Ford and Chrysler to have production in Canada than have corporate welfare checks paid by Canadian taxpayers to these companies to secure the jobs in Canadian plants.
Another thing I'd like to ask about, and I hate to invoke the name of the great anti-Semite Henry Ford here, but he did say—
I didn't know he was an anti-Semite.
But he did say way back that he wants to pay his workers a fair wage so they can afford to buy the products that they produce. And in your book, you talk about how the middle class is somewhat of their own worst enemy because they're responsible for pushing Walmart to get ever lower and lower prices and wanting to buy cheaper and cheaper goods, and Walmart and Amazon to that degree as well, going after how cheap can they buy things, which means they were basically buying products that were putting themselves out of jobs. Can you
Absolutely.
address that?
Absolutely, Norm. I mean, one of the benefits of globalization hasn't just been higher profits. It has been higher profits, but also cheaper prices to consumers, and that's why it's appealed to many people. And indeed, Walmart parking lots are filled with American workers, Canadian workers, who are shopping themselves out of their very jobs, because you could rest assured that if the goods that they were buying at Walmart were produced in Canada or the United States, it wouldn't be selling at the same prices that Walmart is selling those goods when they're made in China for $1.50 an hour. And that is one of the contradictions of, of globalization. I mean, Ford was right at that point back then. We want workers to make enough to be able to buy the cars. And that's why I said in my presentation, in the heydays of the middle class, at least in Canada and the United States, in the 50s and 60s, middle class workers made the very things they consumed. That's no longer the case today.
I'm going to turn it over now to some questions from the audience. The first one's very pertinent here is, could you please define the middle class? You've been talking about it. What are the parameters of the middle class?
Okay, well, again, the OECD comes out with income levels of who the middle class is. It's anybody between 70 to 200% of the median household income of the country involved. And I would have to say that, in Canada, it's between, roughly speaking, 28 to 70,000 with a median income of 40,000. As I say, the numbers, Norm, they're slightly different in the different OECD economies because median income is different, but it's generally in that range.
Okay, the next question is, what will the pandemic debt load, what is it going to do, Jeff, to the middle class? It seems ominous that they're going to
Well,
be one badly hurt.
actually, Norm, I think the pandemic is a good news story for the middle class, because what it's done is expose the fragility of global supply chains. I mean, when you absolutely needed a respirator or an N95 mask, the fact of the matter is you couldn't get one. And those supply chains that you depended on weren't working. I mean, take Canada, for example. There's a company in Montreal, Medicom. It has a plant in Shanghai that makes N95 masks, as did 3M. But neither 3M nor Medicom could get any masks out of their Shanghai plants because those plants were commandeered by some official from the Chinese Communist Party who decided where they could go and where they couldn't. So all of a sudden, local production meant everything. And I think that you're going to see a change in that. I think it's not just Donald Trump. I think it's shareholders, and I think it's consumers who are going to want to have local sourcing. And local sourcing means bringing back those global supply chains from places like China back home. Now, the one interesting historical anecdote here is that all pandemics in the past, and this goes back to the bubonic plague, to the Spanish flu, have raised wages in their wake. Now, they raised wages in their wake just because of the physical decimation of the labor force, that, millions of peasants and workers died, and hence the price of labor rose. Well, fortunately, we hope that that's not going to happen this time around, at least not to the proportions that have happened in the past. But if this means rejigging global supply chains, if this means deglobalization and a swing back to local production, then it'll have the same effect. Because when you bring jobs back home, you pay local wages. And all of a sudden, workers who haven't seen a real wage increase in 50 years may all of a sudden start to see one. So perhaps there could yet be, I mean, I hear what you're saying about the debt levels, and that's going to be a huge issue going forward. But if it rejigs world trade, there may yet be a silver lining for all those middle class workers who have been deemed expendable.
So another viewer asked, are you in favor of policies that require buy made in Canada goods? And if so, why? And the question is this something that government should be promoting, or is this leading to protectionism? And does that lead us back to the Great Depression where, well, you're the economist here, but the Great Depression, the protectionism seemed to make it go worse and longer. What do you?
Okay, well, that's a whole other story of what happened back in the 1930s. It wasn't just protectionism, but you're right. I mean, buy Canada means more jobs in Canada. What does that mean? It means higher prices for consumers, but it means goods producing jobs for workers and higher wages for workers. So that's the kind of trade-off that we're talking about. I mean, low prices is great if you got an income to buy, but if low prices cost you your job, what difference does it matter how cheap the goods are in Walmart if you no longer have a job? So, you know, when we're talking about why the 1% have done so well, and we're talking about why 80% of Canadian households have done so poorly, maybe protectionism isn't the boogeyman that so many people think it is.
Okay, Jeff, somebody else asked, there's a tendency to think about those displaced as being exclusively in manufacturing and labor. Please comment on the increasing displacement of white collars, service, professional workers by expanded visa issuance and temporary foreign worker programs.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's happening. You're seeing it in the business services sector. We're seeing the same thing that's happened in the goods sector, a little bit harder in the personal sector because you're not going to go overseas to get a haircut or get a chiropractic appointment. But if it's a question of processing business data or financial data, absolutely, you can have that done offshore in places like India at a fraction of the cost. Immigration's a big issue here, and I think it is an issue in Canada as it is elsewhere. And that's also going to be a factor. It's not everybody's wages who are hurt by immigrants, but certainly low wage, unskilled workers have historically been hurt, and that's why they haven't always been, you know, greeting migrants with open arms. And that's been the case in a lot of places, Canada, the US, Australia. And in the past, it's been business organizations that have been the biggest supporters of immigration. The argument, of course, behind immigration is that with the birth rate in Canada and in the US and in most OECD countries below the replacement rate, how can the labor force grow? And if the labor force doesn't grow, how will GDP grow? Which is all true. But the bigger issue is that most Canadians haven't enjoyed the benefits of GDP growth, nor have Americans. So why should most Canadians or Americans be so concerned about GDP growth when the fruits of GDP growth have gone to such a narrow slice of the population?
One viewer asked, if you bring back all the jobs from China and elsewhere, don't you risk upheaval in those countries that could lead to war? And that would be, to me, civil war as much as external war, because they've gotten used to having these jobs, and if they're in danger of losing them, what happens to them?
So what are we saying? We should give up all their jobs so things are good over there? Okay, I mean, that's what's happening. That's what's happening under the World Trade Organization. And yeah, China's middle class has been a huge beneficiary, but understand that that's the mirror image of our middle class shrinking. How long do we want to, how long do we want to nurture their growth at our expense? I think that it's after 4 years of Trump, I think the needle has moved on that. I think Americans' attitude toward their trade deals with China are significantly different than it was under the Obama administration. And we'll see whether Biden can reverse easily what Trump has done on trade. I think he does so at his peril.
The public sector in Western democracies used to be middle class, but they seem to have risen above that, leaving the middle class behind. So somebody here is asking, how will Western economies be able to afford public sector wages and pension liabilities if the middle class continues to shrink?
Well, they won't. And so what happens is those public pensions will be cut as they have in places like Greece and Spain. And they'll be cut in other places as well. We are now facing massive public sector deficits. We're facing public sector deficits, in Canada, north of 350 billion, in Ontario, 38 billion. As a percentage of the economy, these are deficits we have not seen since the Great Depression or World War II, up until World War II years. And I think that this is going to be followed by huge fiscal restraint. The question is, who's going to pay for deficit reduction? Is it going to be the 1%, the wealthiest in Canada, who have never seen their wealth increase faster than they have in the last 10 years? Or is it going to be the very people who are marginalized in this economy, the middle class? I mean, when it comes to negotiating trade deals like the ones that Chrystia Freeland just did, the middle class are expendable. But when it comes to paying down Chrystia Freeland's massive federal deficit, rest assured the middle class will be uppermost in the government's mind.
When we were talking about the auto companies before and federal provincial money going in there, somebody has asked here, what economic incentives should Canada or the provinces advance to attract businesses? And I'll add, or should they at all?
Well, again, like I would have preferred an auto pack trade deal to get GM and Chrysler and Ford to invest in car plants in Southern Ontario than big corporate welfare checks. During the auto pact, which started back in the mid 1960s, we did that. It was very successful. We didn't have to give hundreds of millions of dollars of corporate welfare checks to Ford and GM and Chrysler. It seems now that we do. I guess if you're Jerry Diaz at Unifor or Chrystia Freeland, you'd say that's better than nothing. And I suppose it is. But why should the middle class taxpayer have to pay for that when that could have been achieved through very different kinds of trade policies than the trade policies that Chrystia Freeland negotiated in the recent NAFTA renegotiations?
So we've got the trade deals already in place. I don't know if there's any others that they're currently negotiating.
Well, China's just come up with a massive trade deal, the regional comprehensive economic agreement that would replace the Pan-Pacific Partnership deal that Trump walked away from, that Obama had endorsed. I hope Biden doesn't get sucked into that, because like the Pan-Pacific Partnership deal, those deals will screw American workers. Because if American and Canadian workers have to compete with wages in Asia that are 1/10 their costs, guess what? They're going to lose their job.
So what should governments be doing, companies be doing to get more people employed?
Well, a lot of that has to do with the COVID shutdown. Hopefully, that will reverse itself when we have general vaccination and inoculation of the population. But I think we need to have a different model of economic growth than what we've seen for the last 20 to 30 years. I think we have to concentrate on what kind of jobs we're creating. I think we need to create middle class jobs. That means creating jobs that actually produce the goods that the middle class consumes. And I think if we do that, we're going to find a lot healthier economy, and we're going to see a rebound in the middle class, the likes of which we haven't seen for the last 30 years.
Do we need a resurgence in private sector unions, and how is that going to
Yes,
happen?
but you're not going to get a resurgence in private sector unions if the firm can move the plant to Mexico in a heartbeat or China. You're only going to get a resurgence in unionization if you can't move the factory to China and Mexico. And then it's going to depend on how strong the economy is. When the economy is weak, doesn't matter if there's unions, you won't get a wage increase because firms will accept a strike. But when the economy is strong and we're getting close to full employment, we will see wage increases because you just can't all of a sudden close the factory and ship those jobs to some overseas sweatshop. So in order to have a resurgence in private sector unionization, you need to have different trade policies.
What about things like artificial intelligence and factory automation? As that becomes more and more prevalent, does it even matter where the goods are being made?
Well,
Because nobody's going
right.
to
I
be
mean,
making them anywhere.
that's a story that the auto industry will tell you. The auto industry will say, hey, don't blame Mexico, blame the robots. But the fact of the matter is that the new auto plant in Mexico is just as mechanized as that auto plant would have been had it been in Michigan or Ontario. The only difference is that all of that automated machinery and all of those robots are being ran by workers making $2.50 an hour instead of $25 to $30 an hour. So yes, the employment footprint of an auto plant is less than it was 20 to 30 years ago because of automation. But by and large, the biggest reason for the decline of jobs in the American and Canadian auto industry are not robots. It's where the plants have been put. And all of the assembly plants up until the Donald Trump presidency have been put in Mexico.
Jeff, what about the energy sector in Canada? On one side, you've got government, a federal government anyway, that appears to be severely anti-energy and fossil fuel energy anyway. And on the other end, you've got the renewable business. So if you're out in Western Canada, you're in the energy sector and you're in the middle class, what future do you have?
Well, I don't know what the federal government's policy is. I mean, why the hell did they buy the Trans Mountain Pipeline if they didn't want to support the hydrocarbon industry? Um, the real nemesis of Canada's oil industry is not carbon emissions. The real nemesis is shale production, because the fact of the matter is that Canadian oil sands production cannot compete with US shale production. And that's a problem because the best prices for bitumen, heavy oil, is not in China or Japan. The best market for that is in the US. And, the US was going to be the market that would support the massive expansion of the oil sands, but that was before the shale revolution. And with the shale revolution that has seen US oil production go from 5 million barrels a day to 12 million barrels a day, the US simply doesn't need Canadian heavy oil production like it did 10 years ago. And that's a real challenge to the industry.
I think we have time for one more question. This is a very good one, actually. With interest rates at about 0%, how will people in this country fund retirement for all the baby boomers in the foreseeable future?
Well, maybe interest rates won't stay at 0%. I know the Bank of Canada and the Federal Reserve Board are saying they'll stay here forever. But I think if you look at history and you look at where deficits have gone and where interest rates have gone, massive public sector deficits is not usually the context for record low interest rates. I think interest rates are going to rise. And that's when deficit reduction is going to become the order of the day. because right now the cost of financing these massive deficits are trivial because of their very interest rates you point out. But what happens if interest rates start to rise? And they can rise not just because the Bank of Canada or the Federal Reserve Board raises their overnight lending rate, but they can rise because the yield curve steepens so that the cost of capital for 5, 10, 20-year mortgages starts to rise very sharply. Well, then we got a problem. And then we'll see who pays this deficit. Will the plutocrats once again be exempted as they were in 2009, 2010? Maybe. Or maybe the Expendables will have more of a say this time.
Well, just as an extension on that, the government, the federal government likes to say that they can do all this almost unlimited spending because interest rates are so low. But when you look at how they're funding their debt, they really haven't extended debt to take advantage of those long rates, those low rates in the long term.
That's right. They aren't. But the point is, they may control the cost of short-term credit through the Bank of Canada, but they don't control the bond market. They don't control the yield curve. And yes, right now, like a 10-year long run Canada is like 0.5%, but that's because half of the economy is shut down. You see the economy getting back on its feet after sort of a mass inoculation against the COVID virus. And I think you'll see the yield curve steepen. And then all of a sudden, a 5-year, 10-year Canada isn't going to be 0.5%. And all of a sudden, the cost of financing these massive deficits is going to be huge. That's the time when we usually are going to start to see big tax increases. The question is, who's going to pay those tax increases? The middle class or the 1%? I'm betting on the middle class.
Thank you very much, Jeff. It was a pleasure.
My pleasure, Norm, and I understand we have common roots.
Yes, we do. Just so people know, I went to Faywood Public School with Jeff's older sister, Joyce. And when I'm on BNN Bloomberg, his daughter, Margot, is my producer. We have a lot in common.
Well, great interview, Norm, and great meeting you in person.
Thank you. We'll turn it over to Stephen.
Hi again, everyone. Thank you very much. I hope you found tonight's program very enlightening. I certainly did. I would like to extend our thanks to Jeff for speaking and for Norman for being a great moderator and posing some very challenging and interesting questions to Jeff. Just as far as the congregation goes, this program is, we find putting on these programs is really important to our community. It's great for us to be able to get together. As I said earlier, the challenges of getting together in person are quite limited today. So this is the best way to do it. And it's an opportunity for people to get away from the TV and the Netflix and actually be able to join an event online and learn about something interesting. I'd really like to thank Jeff. I think you've given us all a very interesting perspective. I'm sure a lot of us have just been inundated with negative news and negative thoughts about Trump in the last few weeks or the last few months with respect to the pandemic. And I think you shed some light on some positive aspects of the Trump administration and what they've done from a positive perspective for the economy. And from a personal perspective, I think I'm hoping that by having continued significant Republican representation, particularly in the Senate, that will somewhat temper the efforts of Biden to just go from one extreme to the other. And hopefully they can all figure out a way to work together and come to something in the middle without having sort of the shenanigans of Trump and some of the tirades that he's gone on, have more of a sane working government that cooperates, shall we say. Also like to thank the Adult Education Committee and its chair, Joe Traeger, as well as Phil David. Executive Director, for putting on tonight's program and planning it. For all of you, just want you to know there'll be a recording of tonight's presentation and it'll be posted to the Adath website in a couple of days. And you will have the ability to order the Expendables at that time as well. Once again, thank you very much for attending this evening's presentation and have a great evening.